Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 4th chapter of the book of Revelation, and there's only 4 verses I want to cover before we read the actual chapter itself, the first of which is the first opening verse in the first chapter, the final 3 of which are the final 3 verses of the third chapter which precedes it. So in the opening verse we read, Revelation of Yahshua Messiah, which Elohim gave to show his servant what has to take place with speed, and he signify it by sending his angels to his servant John. So there's 3 who's in there. Yahshua Messiah, from whom the revelation springs, that's the what, and angels act as intermediaries, and John faithfully records what he sees and what he hears. But it's not until the chapter we're covering today where there's a visual component, a visionary component of his revelation. For the next chapter, for the first 3 chapters, he's really writing by the inspiration of the Ruach Kadesh. But he's writing to 7 real locations on earth, which are identified in the order he addresses them in chapters 2 and 3 and verse 11 of chapter 1. But what the passage doesn't tell us, and what we only know through additional information, is where. And we know that John was located on the Greek penal colony island of the Roman Emperor, which was 6 by 10 miles, and was just an isolated rock, a penal colony in prison for prisoners, where John was for his Christian confession. And when is 96. Now there's an element of urgency, what has to take place with speed, and that urgency, he could come at literally any time. So I think even though what he promises didn't come to pass immediately and hasn't come to pass yet, it will be fulfilled, and we always have to maintain the urgency. This is why we pray for his kingdom to come, as we are instructed to do in the Lord's Prayer. So now that we know where the why will reveal itself in the writing, we're not gonna we covered why he was there, but why these things have to pass is a question that eventually answers itself through the reading. But we just want to read the 3 verses which close the 3rd chapter. These are addressed to Laodicea, which was the smallest of the 7 cities addressed, but they had the longest message. It spans the range of verses 14 through 22, and we're going to pick it up on verse 20. See, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I shall come to him and dine with him, and he with me. So that door is going to, spoiler alert, it's going to repeat itself in the first verse of the 4th word, but the open invitation, anyone hears his voice, who hears his voice? His sheep respond to the voice of the shepherd. That's how we know we are guided by that voice, and he will open a door. If we invite ourselves up, he will respond. If we take 1 step towards him, he will take 2 towards us. To him who overcomes, I shall sit with me on my throne, as I also overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. So to him who overcomes, that is, there's always a promise. There's a 6-fold formula. I did these in Revelation chapter 2, I divided in 2. I did 3 before discovering the 6-fold formula. But there's always a promise attached to one who overcomes. So these were churches in the midst of persecution, suffering through the furnace of affliction, but they are all promised something for maintaining the integrity of the faith with endurance. And the promise here is he will sit in thy throne. And what we read of the throne room of the Father in the 4th chapter. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Ruach says to the assembly. So that's nothing new. That phrase, if not verse, it's often combined in verses, but that phrase repeats itself through all the 7 assemblies addressed. But what's important is that the Spirit is the one who is speaking the message prior to verse 3. When we read of who he is in the 4th chapter, it's not until the 5th chapter we read that it is Yahweh the Father. But he is, for the sake of reference, whenever we read the pronoun he, that is a reference to him. After this, opening verse of 4th chapter, after this I looked and saw a door having been opened in the heavens, and the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I shall show you what has to take place after this. So there's that visionary component. After writing all this and being inspired to the Spirit, he looked and he saw a door boat being opened. This marks his translation. Even though he's physically on the Isle of Patmos, he is translated to the throne room, the sacred of sacreds in heaven at that moment in time. And he's accompanied first by a voice which says, "Come up here and I will show you." So that's a visible and a verbal element in the one communicating to him. And what has to take place after this? Now, after the 5th chapter, this describes the heavenly throne room from whom the proceedings come, but much of it is unpleasant aspects of the warfare which awaits us in the tribulation. But these 2 chapters are sort of a blissful interlude where we meet the Father as he is in heaven, accompanied by angels whose entire ministry consists of perpetual praise. And there's a lot more than just angels engaged in the worship. And what has to come to pass. Now, it's alternately translated as what must come to pass after this. So what must come, I think, is a better word, because it is the will, and what he wills must come to pass. And what he's telling us is that perfection may be out of our grasp now in the earth as we find ourselves, but is beholdable to us in the future. What happened to John is our eventual destiny and goal and objective and promise. Verse 2, "And immediately I came to be in the Spirit, and saw a throne placed in the heavens, and seated on the thrones." So immediate, there's a sense of urgency. As soon as he looked, he was translated there. He looked and he was there. So he was on Patmos in one moment. He was looking up. There was the door. He heard the knocking. He knocked on the door, and the door opened itself. And he is translated from heaven to earth, where he is beginning to behold what constitute the apocalyptic visions. Now, the word apocalypse was, it just roughly translates as that which pertains to the consummation of human history or end times. And this genre sort of flourished in the intertestamental period, but it is of dubious inspiration and reliability and accuracy. But there are apocalyptic visions in the Old Testament as well as the New. Book of Revelation is the only book. It's a category of one, uniquely, like the book of Acts. That's the only history book. Revelation is the only book categorized as prophetic in this, and the nature of these prophecies are concentrated on what waits ahead of us. And the Spirit translates him into the throne of the heaven, so he's in the most sacred location in the heaven and the earth at this time, and seated on the throne, beholding his majesty in his radiant splendor. "And he who sat there was like a jasper and a ruby stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne, like an emerald in appearance." So the first we read of 3 gems here. The jasper is a clear gem, and first we read that he prefaces his language, a lot of it with like, so he doesn't have an earthly comparison. He virtually ransacks the Greek language to find a word that is befitting for the description of what he is beholding. And the one he comes up with here is jasper and ruby stone. Jasper is a clear gem. Ruby is a red gem, and both appeared on the breastplate of the Old Testament high priest. So that's and the 4th stone on that breastplate, representative of the Lion of Judah, because the order in which the tribes were born was Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Judah is the 4th born, and it's through him who is the son. That's the tribe that he descended from. And there's also a rainbow, which is a reminder of his promise made to Noah that he would never destroy the earth again through a flood. One baptism is sufficient enough. The world had been replenished, although much of its wickedness, all of it, pretty much it's still wicked, but it's, one baptism was sufficient to accomplish the purpose. And that surrounds the throne like an emerald once more in appearance. So appearance is not substance. It's perception, a lot of it. So he's bereft of words to accurately convey, because there is literally no earthly representation for what he is beholding in this exalted throne room. And around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, dressed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their head. So surrounding this throne were 24 thrones. The number 24 is numerologically significant as a division as a multiplication of 12, which represents, among other things, the 12 apostles and the 12 tribes of Israel. And it also features in the 144,000, that's the elect, the living elect, who's going to eventually reread. But so the 24 elders are a representative, we personally feel, of the Old Testament tribes, the tribes of Israel, and the New Testament apostles. Those are the 24 elders around the throne, and they are clothed in white. White is symbolic of purity and divinity, and they are clothed in the righteousness of the Messiah, without which we humans could never hope to make it to the presence of the Father in heaven. And the crowns on their gold on their head. Now, eventually, we read that they have crowns, but eventually we read that they put them down in submission to the King of Kings and Master of Masters and God of very gods. And a crown is also familiar. It's a metaphor for salvation throughout the New Testament. And out of the throne came lightnings and thunders and voices, and 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of Elohim. So lightnings and thunders, what does that remind us of? That reminds us of the second coming. It's going to be like lightning from the east to the west, and no one's going to miss it. You're going to know there's literally going to be lightning from the east to the west on that day. So that is much of what we read here. And thunder is often likened to a voice of divinity. We can read the voice of Yahweh in Psalm 29. I'd recommend that for, the most detailed description of a certain segment of his voice. And the 7 lamps of fire, that number 7 is symbolically significant. There were 7 churches addressed. So 7 is the number of completion, fulfillment, and divinity. So that's why, and the lamps of fire, now in the ancient world, we have to put ourselves in an ancient mindset. Fire was a more imminent form of light than were the stars, even though they had no idea that the stars were as radiant as we know them to be through modern scientific. But lamp suffices to accomplish the communicative person. The lamps of fire are burning before the throne, and there are 7, that number, spirits of Elohim. We can read of these in passages such as Isaiah 11:2. The spirit of wisdom, the spirit of counsel, the spirit of fear of Yahweh, etc. I did one on that. You can type in Corey Johnston, Isaiah 11, the capital letters, Golden Age. And before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures covered with eyes in front and back. So one interpretation I'm familiar with of the crystal is the exalted and sanctified earth. It's going to be replenished and restored to its rightful whole, and it's the new Jerusalem of what a new earth, new heaven and new earth, which awaits us. We read the most descriptive description of that in the 21st chapter of this book, and I did one on that too. You can type in Corey Johnston, Revelation 21, New Heaven, New Earth, and maybe New Jerusalem. I honestly forgot how I titled it. Where were we? Oh yeah, 6th verse. So these 4 living creatures are all alike. There are 4 of them, and that number is numerologically significant in animals. And 4 times 3 is numerologically related to the number 12, and 3 is a Trinitarian witness of divinity. So that sinks into the numerology, but they are described in greater detail than the eyes in the front and in the back. That means you can't sneak up on them. They literally have eyes on the back of their head. And the first living creature was like a lion, and the second living creature like a calf, and the third living creature had a face like a man, and the 4th living creature was like a flying eagle. Now, interpreting these allegorically is a matter of caution. Now, one way I've heard of it looked at is from a New Testament lens. So the respective animals in the order in which they are arranged. First off, these animals, the four types, are not original. We can read of the same thing, but they're in a different order in Ezekiel's 10th verse of the first chapter of the book, which bears his name. But the order is coincidentally, I'm arguing, a reflection of the order of the Gospels in which they appear. Now, each author had their respective emphasis. Matthew emphasized, he was writing to a Jewish audience, he was writing as the king, the Messiah, likened to a lion animalistically, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. And a calf, more familiarly translated as an ox. This is the beast of burden, which a domesticated beast, which is a servant, and that is the emphasis of Mark's depiction of the Messiah. And the face like a man is Luke, whose emphasis appears to be the Son of Man, him being human and interacting and touching and impacting humans. And the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. Eagle is likened to divinity, and that they soar the heavens. This is John's emphasis as the son of Elohim. He uniquely emphasizes his pre-existence. So that, and of course, but the Bible this was the final composition of the Bible, but the compilation of the Bible, there was a host of difficulties in forming it together. There was a lot of fraudulent letters written in people's name, and it took a few years to... But the fact that they typologically allude to is coincidental, I'm arguing. It may be, one of the magnificent ways of the Spirit working out, but what we know from John is all that he had to work with was the Old Testament. So I want to show you a physical diagram. This is literally the only way to show it. This is the arrangement of the tabernacle in the old times. So they were always at the front and center was the east, and the rear was the west, and the south and north are respective. I know it's confusing, but we usually liken from south to north. But at the bottom of the tabernacle, as they were arranged, and there may or may not be one of those boring Old Testament books about ritualistic regulations, or this may just be known from tradition, but I've been told that at the front and center of the tabernacle were the tribes of Judah. They were represented by a lion. They were the noblest of creatures. They were the royal, natural rulers, as declared in Genesis 49. And the Messiah himself is likened to the lion from the tribe of Judah in chapter Revelation 5:5. And at the south, so at the west was the most significant tribe of the northern kingdom, Ephraim, so much so that Ephraim and Israel are used interchangeably, and their animalistic representation was the ox. These were the strongest of all the beasts and beings. And at the south was Reuben, representative of man, supposedly, allegedly the wisest of creatures, clearly the wisest. And at the north was Dan, who were the eagles. They were the swiftest ones. And the concept of swiftness is going to bleed over as we describe the wings, which are shuddering. So we feel we don't know that John anticipated what he did and anticipated in advance. What we do know is that he had the Old Testament. He had a supernatural power guiding him to inspire it and interpret it in new ways to describe this vision. So that's the only slate he had to work with. Hence, I'm arguing in favor of an Old Testament interpretation of verse 7. I'm not saying the New Testament is wrong. I'm just saying it's more accurately, we can affirm with more clarity that this was the basis that John was working from. In verse 8, and the four living creatures, each having 6 wings, were covered with eyes around and within, and they did not cease day or night, saying, Sacred, 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 Yahweh El Shaddai, who was, and who is, and who is coming. So these the wings there are 6 of them on each of them, but that wings pertains to swiftly. And remember what we read in the opening verse of Revelation, what must come to pass soon. So there's an element of swiftness in that, and we have the urgency that he could come in our lifetimes when we least expect it. We should always be watching, witnessing, working, and waiting. Waiting is not enough. We want to remain active and engaged, much like the living creatures with its wings fluttering and flying. And they're engaged in perpetual prayer. And the answer is that they were not now in a human lens. This contradicts the what we read of in Matthew 6:7. Do not do vain repetitions. That's how the Gentiles pray, and we witness this certainly in the battle of the prophets of Baal versus Elijah in the Mount Carmel showdown, when they were working themselves in a frenzy, calling on their God. So that element of repetition, what's true for angels is not necessarily true for us. God wants you to use your mind and brain. He doesn't want you going over and rote. And there's a difference between praying it and saying it. So I hate to single out any denomination, but I do believe the Roman Catholic Church is the most quantitative, if not qualitative, prominent number of this violation of repetitive prayer. But the angels, they are living their prayer. They are not saying it, they are literally praying it, and there are a few other things we hear from them, but they are in the presence of the Eternal One, whose presence demands perpetual praise. And we read of the past, present, and future. Who was, he always was, he was pre-existent, he put the spark of life in creation. And who is, he is always present, he is omnipresent, and who is coming. So this is a reference to the second coming of the one who was pre-existent. John writes of him as the Word who was in the beginning with Elohim and became Elohim and all that rest. And when the living creatures gave esteem and respect and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever. So these living creatures are giving 3 things to him: the honor, the recognition he is due, respect, and gratitude. So a challenge I want to invite you to is count the things you have, to make a list if necessary, the things you have cause to be praiseful or thankful of God to, and really remember it, and that'll enhance your esteem and respect and reverence for him who sits on the throne, who is eternal, and out of his magnificent grace does deign to share, make us immortal, us unworthy creatures. The 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and bows before him who lives forever and ever, and they cast their crowns before the throne, saying, so once more that there's that number, the 24, the apostles and the tribes of Israel. In my interpretation, they are surrendering an abject submission to, they are crowned, they are kings, they are ruling, they are co-rulers, but they are ultimately submitted to the one who lives forever and ever, before whom they drop their crowns and kneel and bow and praise and adulate and just in every way worship for their entire eternal existence. You are worthy, O Yahweh, to receive esteem and respect and power, for you have created all, and because of your will they are, and were created. So this explains why they are saying what they are saying. They are saying what they are saying because he is worthy. He deserves to receive this mountain and bask of endless praise. Because he created everything, he set everything in motion. He is the omniscient one who conceived of creation in a design, the omnipotent one who set it in motion, and he carries the accompanying attribute of omnipresence, which is the capability to be everywhere at once. And his will is supreme and sovereign, and it's non-negotiable. So much of he created not out of any need or necessity, but out of his intrinsic goodness. He created as an act of love to bring. He doesn't need us. He is a self-sufficient, self-sustaining, self-created being. So he does not need us. We need him. I just want to instill that priority in your mind. That there's just no need for God to bring you home. He does want you to bring you home. We do read in Ezekiel 33:11 that he takes no pleasure or sadistic delight in the destruction of witness, but you have to meet him home on his terms. So I hope one of the things I'm trying to impart on you is what those terms are. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.